Okay, so normally we think of measuring like this, right? We're going to take an actual measurement of something and see how long it is, how much space we have, counting things. In this case, we're thinking about variables in a research study, right? So specifically what we're doing here is we're assessing the construct validity. So what you're actually asking is that measurement in that research study, are they actually doing a good job of measuring whatever they say they're measuring? So if you're measuring how much these individuals are helping at home, how good of a measurement is that? If you're measuring stress level, are the researchers doing a good job of measuring stress level, right? So that's when we're asking about construct validity. Now, there are two different aspects of this that we want to keep in mind. We have the conceptual variable. Okay, now, yes, it has variable attached. Yes, we've used that term various times. I know it gets confusing, but don't focus on that term so much. Focus on what it's explaining, what it's trying to define. The conceptual variable is the idea of what you're trying to measure. Conceptually, what are you trying to measure? I'm trying to measure love. I'm trying to measure anxiety. I'm trying to measure friendship. It's this idea of what you're trying to measure that may be difficult to define, that might be difficult to say like, hey, it's right there, because things like how many people come into the store, that's easy, right? Well, okay, I want to see how many people come into a store. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. But measuring love, that's more difficult, right? What does that look like? What am I measuring? Am I measuring how many times a person texts, how often they text each other? Is that my measurement of love? Am I measuring how much time they're around each other? Am I measuring their heart rate around each other, right? So conceptually, I could say it's love, but in actuality, how am I measuring it? That would be the operational variable, right? How did you actually measure that thing that you say you're measuring? That conceptual variable. How did you actually measure it? What did you actually count? What kind of information did you get from the participants to be able to say that you're actually measuring love, anxiety, or whatever it is that you're measuring? We're going to review 3 specific types of variables, or measurement types, not just variables, right? How we measure those variables. So there's self-report, there's observational, and there's physiological. And I'm going to go into detail about what these are, give you some examples, but first, just to briefly review them. Self-report, I'm asking you, let's stick with that variable I used earlier, love. I'm asking you, well, how in love are you with this person? Here, take the survey. That's self-report. Observational, I'm observing you. Now, I might be there in person. I might have a camera recording you and later review the footage. But I'm observing you to look for key behaviors that I've decided identify love, that reflect love, that indicate love, right? I'm observing to look for behaviors. And then physiological, some change in the body, heart rate. I'm taking note of your heart rate and seeing, well, is it speeding up? Is your heart rate going up? I'm looking at your breathing. I'm looking at your perspiration, right? Are you sweating? I'm using these bodily reactions and changes to decide, is that some indication of love, right? So again, self-report, you're asking the participants to give their report of how they feel in love. Observational, I'm observing, I'm watching. Physiological, I'm looking at body physiological changes in the body of participants to measure this variable. I'm interested in this example, love. Okay, so in terms of self-report, again, this is mostly focusing on surveys. You're asking them to report back to you Primarily, that's the kind of example we're focusing on, right? So to give you some examples of self-report, you might have used Likert scale questions. How often did you eat this month due to stress? You weren't hungry, you were stressed, and you ate because of that. 1 to 3 times this week, 3 to 5, 5 to 7. Or maybe we leave it open-ended. How many times did you eat? Well, you wouldn't want to ask numbers. You want to get more information if it's open-ended. Describe a situation where you ate due to stress this week. Give me as many details as possible. That would be a self-report question as well, right? You're asking the participant, report that information back to me, the researcher. Tell me as much as you can, and there's different ways we can do that, right? But the main characterization of this type of measurement, remember we're talking about measurements, is that you're asking for information from the participant. You might be a participant in a study. I'm asking you for information to measure what I'm interested in measuring. You might also, in the self-report approach, ask for teachers or parents to rate a child if you're interested in children's behavior, right? You're interested in measuring children's anxiety on the first day of school for some reason. Maybe the child doesn't completely understand what you're asking, so you ask the parents or you asked the teacher to do some type of report on the child, right? So there's different ways to get the self-report data. The primary way is to ask the participant to give you some information. Okay, so for observational measurements, you still have to go through the same process of thinking, what is it that I want to measure? And then creating these operational definitions, right? So if you're interested in seeing, well, how do children play on the playground? But specifically, I'm looking at aggression. I want to see how aggressive are younger children compared to older children, right? What you would do is you would have to first define aggression. You have to operationalize it. And then you would go into the field, be there in person, or record, and then count how many times does that happen. So kind of think about, what would you call aggression in children? Like, how would you define that? Now, some people might say, well, anytime they touch, right? Well, that could include patting on the back. That could include, just playing tag. So maybe that's not a great definition, okay? Well, anytime they frown, they furrow their face, there's some sign of anger in their face, they push, and the other child shows some sign of displeasure, unhappiness, fear, right? There's some reaction that happens as well. Anytime these combination of things happens, I'm going to count it as aggression. But some of you might be interested in verbal aggression, right? Well, okay, teasing. Maybe I'm going to count that as aggression. Well, how do you differentiate between playfully teasing and what would be more like bullying, right? How would you differentiate that in your definition? You have to be very clear. So when you're out there counting these forms of aggression, it's very clear to you and the research assistants you've trained to observe what to count. Not just touching. There has to be some sign of an attempt to hurt. You would look at the face of the person who's being aggressive. You would look at the person who's shown the aggression, who's receiving the aggression. You would also take into account the context. Were they playing tag before? Were they running and smiling, right? I would take that into account and then decide whether I count that as a form of aggression. Verbal aggression. Is there some tone that indicates they're joking? Do they laugh afterwards? Right? Like these are things I would take into account when defining it, and then you observe, right? You do have to tailor this based on who you're working with. If you're working with children in a playground setting, that's different than observing adults in a work setting, for example, right? So you would define it, you would create what's called a coding manual, right? You would have your definitions written down in a coding manual, and then you would train the research assistants to follow this coding manual to make sure that everybody on your team is consistently using the same definitions. You would run into issues if somebody felt, okay, anytime that they touch, that's aggression. somebody who, a researcher who thinks, well, pushing is aggression, and a third researcher who thinks, well, both of those are just playing, they're kids, right? So if you're counting different things, that's problematic. The whole reason why we're defining these variables is to make sure we can consistently observe the same thing. So keep that in mind. You do need this coding manual for observational studies where you write down what the definitions are for your different variables. These definitions are called operational definitions. So physiological measurements are any bodily function in a living organism. Well, we're living organisms. We're specifically focusing on participants, and we're trying to see, can we measure our variable of interest by looking at physiological changes in that person, in that individual, right? Heart rate, brain activity, saliva content, right? Cortisol, for example. Maybe you're looking at stress and you're saying, okay, well, I'm going to look at the cortisol content of my participants' saliva as an indication of stress. Maybe I'm looking at hunger. I'm interested in seeing, well, how hungry is this participant? I don't want to ask for a self-report because I think they might be biased, right? I'm looking at diet in the study and the participants know this. So maybe they'll act like they're not hungry because they're on a diet and they want to look good in front of the researcher. So I don't want to self-report. I don't want to do observational because maybe it's difficult to observe. It's difficult to measure hunger. I'm having a difficult time thinking about what specifically I'm going to observe to indicate hunger. Or I'm worried about the researcher being able to observe hunger accurately. Maybe there's some bias that the researcher might introduce. Physiologically, if I look at saliva, not content, but production, how much saliva is being produced, that's difficult for the researcher or the participant to influence. It might be a more accurate measurement of what I'm hoping to look at, right? Hunger. It's seen as more accurate and less prone to bias than self-report and observational measurements, right? So you can look at hormone level, you can look at brain activity, you can look at heart rate, depending on what you want to measure. That's what takes priority here, right? You're looking at what you want to measure first and thinking about, well, what physiological measurements in the individual indicate that variable I'm interested in measuring. So for example, stress level, well, you can look at cortisol content in the saliva. That's easy, right? But something like love, what would you look? Where would you look in the body? What kind of physiological measurement would you get to indicate love? It's a little bit more abstract, right? But you can see in that first example with stress level, how you can get a more direct measurement of stress level through a physiological measurement than self-report or observational, right? Less prone to bias in that example.